Hello, friends. We are back for a few more chapters in Cupid Doesn't Flip Hamburgers. I enjoyed the first two chapters yesterday, and so today we are going to be reading 3 chapters. So you can either listen to the entire reading and then answer all of the questions at the end, or you can pause the video at the end of each chapter and answer the questions that way. That is up to you. All right, let's get started. Chapter 3 is titled Love Bug. There's that prissy Carrie kissing up to Mrs. Rosenbloom, Eddie pointed as he slurped the last of his cherry jello. No fair, Melody said. Mrs. Rosenbloom is giving Carrie a heart button and a cookie. Carrie gets everything, Liza sighed. Carrie's dad owned the Bailey City Bank. Carrie was always bringing new toys to school or bragging about something her dad bought her. I'll make sure she gets a hard time, Eddie said with an evil grin. He grabbed his half-empty lunch tray and headed for Carrie. Mrs. Rosenbloom finished pinning the button on Carrie and spun her around to face Eddie. Why, hello, Eddie, Carrie said with a mouthful of cookie. Fancy meeting you here. Yeah, it's a miracle, Eddie said. Would you like my apple slice? I'd love it, Carrie said, snapping it off Eddie's tray. But then I'd adore anything of yours. She batted her eyelashes at Eddie before nibbling on the apple. Eddie gave her a funny look, then rushed back to his seat. I can't believe you gave Carrie your apple, Melody said. I thought you hated her. I can't stand her, Eddie agreed. I dropped it on the floor. That's why I gave it to her. That wasn't very nice, Liza said. Speaking of nice, do you see the way Carrie keeps looking at you? Howie asked Eddie. The 4 kids turned to see Carrie tossing her blonde hair and flooding her eyebrows in their direction. Melody giggled. I think she's been caught by the love bug. You guys are crazy. Eddie shook his head and looked at Carrie. She smiled and blew him a kiss. Eddie splashed through a mud puddle on his way across the playground the next morning. Melody, Liza, and Howie were huddled under a huge oak tree comparing answers to their math homework. Number 13 has to be 342 hearts, Melody was explaining. Howie shook his head. You weren't supposed to add. You should have subtracted. Liza frowned. I multiplied. What did you get for the answer, Eddie? Eddie looked at his friends like they'd just sprouted broccoli out of their ears. What homework? Melody rolled her eyes. You'll never make it out of 3rd grade unless you do the homework. I'll help you, a sweet voice interrupted. The 4 friends turned to face Carrie. She winked at Eddie. I always have all the answers right, and mine are always right. Eddie kicked his foot into the mud, splattering Carrie's pink boots with brown goo. I don't need any help, he said, especially from you. Then he stomped toward the school. But I don't mind helping you, Carrie insisted as she grabbed his elbow. I brought you something too. Eddie skidded to a stop. You're trying to get me back for yesterday's paper wad. You'd give me the wrong answers just to get me in trouble. Don't be silly, Carrie said, batting her eyelashes at him. Here, this proves I'm not mad at you. She reached inside her book bag and pulled out a red rose. I even snipped the thorns off so you won't get pricked. Eddie backed away and bumped into Melody. It's not every day that a guy gets a flower from his girlfriend, Melody said with a giggle. Carrie is not my girlfriend, Eddie yelled as he ran into the school. Carrie sighed and flipped her golden curls behind her ears. Poor Eddie. I'll just have to try harder. Try harder to do what? Liza asked from behind Melody. Carrie looked at Melody, Howie, and Liza as if she were going to tell them the answers to next week's science test. But then she shook her head and followed Eddie into the school. Never mind. You just wouldn't understand. Something strange is going on at Bailey Elementary, Melody said. Howie nodded. I never dreamed I'd see the day when Carrie was nice to Eddie. It's almost like she's in love with him, Liza said softly. Don't be silly, Melody said. Godzilla is more lovable than Eddie. The three friends nodded and went inside the school building. Once inside, the kids stopped dead in their tracks. Maybe Liza's right, Howie said. Melody started laughing so hard she snorted through her nose. It looks like Carrie has Eddie cornered. Sure enough, Carrie had grabbed Eddie's notebook at the water fountain. I'd love to carry your books, she was telling him. Eddie tugged as hard as he could, but Carrie wouldn't let go. Give it to me! Eddie jerked his notebook one last time, tearing the corner in half. Now look what you've done, Eddie yelled. I'm sorry, Carrie said. I'll get you a new one. Eddie gave her a look and dashed into the classroom. Melody, Howie, and Liza followed and started teasing Eddie. It looks like Carrie's fallen for you, Howie whispered. Eddie took a pencil out of his desk and shook his head. She's just trying to make me mad. It looks like love to me, Melody nodded toward the doorway. Carrie stood there straightening the heart pin on her pink sweater. Then she strode to Eddie and paused beside his desk. She smiled and put a chocolate kiss on his desk. She winked and walked to her own desk. From behind him, Eddie heard Melody giggle as she started singing, Eddie and Carrie sitting in a tree, Kissing. First comes love. But before she could sing anymore, Eddie took the candy kiss and flung it over his shoulder. It landed with a definite thunk on Melody's forehead. Chapter 4, Lovesick. For the first time in his life, Eddie kept his eyes on his schoolwork. He didn't actually do much of it, but he kept his eyes on his paper anyway. He didn't want to look up and catch Carrie staring at him again. That's what happened right in the middle of the science experiment. She'd smiled and winked at him. Then she blew him a kiss. Eddie had spilled an entire test tube of salt water in his lap. Then Howie made kissing noises. Quit it, Eddie warned, or I'll smack you right across the face. By lunchtime, Eddie was ready to leave school, and Bailey City, too. Melody grabbed his shoulder. Looks like you've fallen in love with the smartest girl in class, she teased. She must not be that smart, Eddie interrupted. Not if she likes Eddie. That's enough, Eddie sputtered. There's something very fishy about this. I'll say, Melody laughed. It's fishy that anyone would bring you red roses and candy kisses. Liza nodded. All you deserve are thorns and spinach. Eddie turned his back on his friends and hurried to lunch. The whole school had turned against him. Everyone, that is, except Carrie. And that was even worse. Bread and pink hearts were still all over the cafeteria. Eddie had already had his fill of Valentine's Day nonsense. He grabbed his tray of heart-shaped sandwiches, a pink frosted cupcake, and a cherry-flavored juice and headed for the corner table. He didn't speak when Liza, Howie, and Melody sat down. Instead, he kept his eyes on the new cook. There was something about her that bothered him. He watched her smile and hand out trays of pink and red goop, but Eddie stopped chewing his heart-shaped sandwich when Ben came through the line. Ben was the biggest bully in the 4th grade. Eddie had got some of his best ideas from watching Ben. Eddie couldn't wait to see how Ben handled the new cook. Why so grumpy? Mrs. Rosenblum put her hands on her wide waist and laughed. You need something to sweeten up your insides. Then she pulled a huge cookie from off the top shelf. It was smothered in icing and little pieces of red candy. Eddie licked his lips as Ben wolfed down the cookie. With his hands full, Ben couldn't stop Mrs. Rosenblum from pinning a heart-shaped button onto his shirt. That ought to do the trick, Mrs. Rosenblum said as Ben walked away, still chomping on the cookie. Eddie's eyes widened when he saw the button. It was identical to Carrie's. Eddie smiled when Ben stopped beside Isabel Hart. Look, Eddie said to his friends. Ben's going to let Prissy Issy have it. The 4 kids watched. But Ben didn't spit or burp or tease Izzy. Instead, he sat down beside her and shared his cookie. Eddie drummed his fingers on the table. Something was wrong, really wrong, but he couldn't put his finger on it. And then it came to him. He slapped the table with his hand, sending spoons and forks clattering to the floor. "I've got it," he blurted. "Got what?" Melody asked. "The chicken pox?" Eddie ignored Melody. "I've got the answer to everything." "Great," Howie said. "Then you can take my science test for me." "No," Eddie snapped. "I know why Carrie and Ben are acting like lovesick slugs." "Why?" Liza asked. Eddie looked at his friends and kept his voice low. "Everything was normal until yesterday." "Nothing is ever normal at Bailey Elementary," Melody interrupted. Eddie nodded. "But until then, Carrie and Ben were the same old pests." "What are you getting at?" Howie asked. "It's the work of Mrs. Rosenblum," Eddie explained. "She's invaded Bailey Elementary, and she's armed with love potions." Chapter 5, Love Potions. Howie choked on his heart-shaped sandwich, and Melody laughed so hard she spit milk onto the table. Even Liza got caught in a fit of giggles. "There are no such things as love potions," Melody told Eddie while she mopped up her milk using a red heart napkin. "Mrs. Rosenblum is just spreading good cheer," Liza said. "There's nothing wrong with being nice." "There is if you don't want to be nice," Eddie snapped. "Mrs. Rosenblum is ruining Bailey Elementary. Everyone is turning into gushy, oogle-eyed, love-struck twerps." "You make Mrs. Rosenblum sound like Cupid," Melody said. "Who?" Eddie and Liza asked together. Howie pointed to a picture on the wall. "Cupid is the fat little baby who shoots arrows at people. Whoever gets hit with an arrow falls in love." Eddie shrugged. "Who knows? Maybe she is Cupid. She's not a baby, but you have to admit, she is pretty chubby." His three friends started laughing again. Eddie glared at them and stood up to leave. "You wait and see. Before long, everyone will be a lovey-dovey goody two-shoes, and it'll all be Mrs. Rosenblum's fault." Eddie left his giggling friends and threw his trash in the garbage can. When he turned to leave, his view was blocked by a huge red wall with lacy pockets. He slowly looked up, right into the grinning face of Mrs. Rosenblum. "Howdy," Mrs. Rosenblum said. "It looks like you've lost your best friend. I bet a big old sugar cookie will fill your day with sunshine." No, thanks," Eddie stuttered and backed away. He bumped right into Carrie. Carrie smiled and batted her eyelashes at Eddie. "How about a chocolate kiss?" she asked. Eddie looked at Mrs. Rosenblum and at Carrie. Then he did the only thing he could do. He ran. He darted past a very surprised Mrs. Rosenblum. He skidded around a corner and raced back to the classroom as fast as he could. Eddie's heart was still thumping when the rest of the class quietly filed into the third grade room. Melody whispered to Eddie, "Mrs. Jeepers will turn you into bat bait when she finds out you were running in the cafeteria." Howie nodded. "I bet Mrs. Rosenblum is telling her how rude you were." "I wasn't being rude," Eddie argued. "I was running for my life." Liza laughed. "You were running from a sugar cookie." "A cookie filled with love potion," Eddie said. "You're going to need some of that love potion to save you from Mrs. Jeepers," Melody warned. Their teacher didn't allow her students to be rude. The kids got quiet as Mrs. Jeepers came into the room and looked at Eddie. But Mrs. Jeepers didn't flash her eyes at Eddie, and she didn't rub her mysterious brooch like she usually did when she was angry. Instead, she smiled. Her cheeks were flushed rosy red instead of their usual chalk white color. "What's wrong with her?" Liza whispered. "Do you think she's sick?" No one had time to answer because a loud knock at the door interrupted them. Principal Davis opened the door wearing a huge heart pin. He held out a sugar cookie and smiled at Mrs. Jeepers. "You forgot your cookie," he said, "so I brought it to you." Mrs. Jeepers' face blushed to a deep shade of purple. She took the half-eaten cookie from Principal Davis. Why, thank you, she said. I do love sugar cookies. Principal Davis smiled and waved goodbye. I was happy to bring it. Mrs. Jeepers closed the door and faced her class. What Eddie saw made him drop his math book. Mrs. Jeepers was wearing a heart pin, too. All right, we'll be back to read a few more chapters tomorrow.